Thank you all for joining the Research Roundtable online event of the department. It's been a while since we had our last RRTO. Just to remind you all, these are occasional talks that we've been hosting in the department where we invite researchers, practitioners to talk to us about their work, sometimes work that's really current, but also work that could be significant for other reasons. So today we're very happy to have with us Apoorva Mandavilli, and I hope we'll have a good interaction because Apoorva will speak for a short while and then we will open it up to questions. And those of you who are watching on Facebook and YouTube can also post your questions in the chat and we'll take them up here. And before we go on further, I'll invite Professor Vinod Pavrala to formally introduce our guest today.
Thanks, Usha. So let me join Usha in welcoming Apoorva to this forum. Apoorva has sort of readily agreed to do this when I wrote to her first, in spite of the time differences and all that. And I know it's fairly early in the morning for her. So let me, we are delighted to have Apoorva do this talk on an issue that has consumed a lot of our time, mind space for the last couple of years, especially in journalism and communication context in our own department. So Apoorva Mandavilli is someone who is probably ideal to do this talk. She's been a reporter for the New York Times, reporting on the pandemic almost from the beginning, since early 2020. Her work at NYT focuses on science and global health, and she's been covering the coronavirus pandemic, issues related to vaccinations, the World Health Organizations, the US CDC, FDA and other agencies which are responsible for managing the pandemic. And she's the winner of the 2019 Victor Cohn Prize for Excellence in Medical Science Reporting. She's the founding editor-in-chief of Spectrum, which is an award-winning news site on autism science that has a fairly sizable audience. And she led the team there for more than a decade before she joined the New York Times in May 2020. And she's been a regular contributor prior to that. She's won a number of awards and her work has been published in several prestigious publications, including The Atlantic, Slate, The New Yorker Online, and has also been represented in anthologies like the Best American Science and Nature Writing. Apoorva, we are delighted to have you here. Welcome to the forum, and over to you.
Thank you so much, and thank you for this very kind invitation and introduction. I agreed right away because, as you know, my parents actually live in Hyderabad. So, and I think it's also very nice that for once when I'm introduced, people know how to pronounce my name correctly. So that was very nice. And I'll give you a brief introduction and walk through a little bit of what my reporting has been like for the last couple of years. But I'm hoping that there will also be questions because I've, in my experience, people have a lot of questions about how this has all played out for journalists, especially and journalists in the United States, where things have been very strange at times. So I'm going to share my slide set, and I'll say up front that I'm not tech savvy, and I also don't really know how to do PowerPoint slides. So excuse me if it's not great. Can you all see that?
Yes, that's good.
Great, thank you. So as the title says, this was an unprecedented time in all of our lives. And I'll walk you through a little bit of what I've been doing for the last couple of years. This is just my author page, where if you are interested after the talk, you can go check out stories that I've been working on. as I mentioned, I started writing in Hyderabad. My sister is actually an alumnus of your university, and I visited the campus, so it was particularly nice to present here, and my parents still live here. So I come to Hyderabad at least once a year. But I actually went to high school in Chennai. So I was there till I was finished my 12th standard, and then went to college in the United States at this very small college called Augustana. Excuse me. Which, you know, most people in the United States have actually not heard of, because it's a very small liberal arts school. But I studied chemistry there. And from there, I thought I was going to be a scientist. So every summer I did research, you know, I worked in labs, and then I applied only to graduate schools in the sciences. So I went to the University of Wisconsin-Madison, trying to get a PhD in biochemistry. About 4 years in, I realized that this was actually not for me. I didn't want to be a scientist. I have very broad interests in science. And as you probably know, when you're doing a PhD, you focus on something very narrow, and just, it didn't really satisfy my curiosity. So I recognized and was advised actually by some people who knew that it would be good to combine my interests in writing in English with science. And so I looked into science journalism as a career, and I went to NYU, New York University, which has a journalism program. It is a master's program that lasts about a year and a half. And I get asked a lot by journalism students whether they should go to school. And what I like to say is that what I learned there, I think you don't have to go because it's a vocation and it's something that you can practice and learn. But what I learned at NYU is I unlearned all the bad habits I had learned as a scientist in writing. Scientists use a lot of passive voice, a lot of jargon. They assume way too much knowledge on the part of the reader. And so I tried to unlearn all of those things. And it was also great for networking, because the program that I went to has about 15 or 16 graduates every year. And so almost every publication in the United States, every science publication has an alum from there. So it's a really great way to, you know, make connections. So my very first job was at this place called BioMetNet, which was the first news site for scientists. It's actually dead now, but it was a lovely place to work. And I was there for about just over a year, but maybe a year and a half. And I learned a lot of really great things there, including how to write very quickly on deadline. So I was a daily news reporter there. And so I would sometimes get assigned a story at 11 in the morning and have to reach out, get comment, read the paper, you know, do all of that and file a story by maybe 3 o'clock. And then it would get edited and go up. I mean, it doesn't sound too crazy, but back then we also didn't even have the internet. You know, it wasn't all that developed. And so if you needed somebody's phone number, you had to call the university hotline, get their number, and then talk to the scientist, get their email, because the email addresses were not available on the website, and then email it to them. And so what that taught me is just really how to write quickly. And so it's a skill, it turns out, that never really goes away. I've spent most of my career as an editor, but when I had to start writing on deadline again for the Times, it came back very quickly. So from there, I went to, I became the news editor of a science journal called Nature Medicine. It's part of a family of journals. The flagship journal is called Nature, and it's a very prestigious science journal. And I was the news editor of Nature Medicine. And over the course of 5 years or so, I developed the news section there, you know, from a couple of pages a month to about 13 pages a month. You know, it started including things like longer stories and profiles and all kinds of other things. And because I had had this experience of developing a website and a news section from start, I was recruited to launch this other website on autism science. I was recruited by a nonprofit foundation that's funded by a billionaire. And at first it was just me, actually. It was one person, staff of one, with some freelancers. And Spectrum was intended to be a news site for scientists who work on autism research. But because there's so little credible information out there in the world about autism research, it actually quickly became popular even with families and with people who have autism themselves. So about half the audience is actually non-scientists now. And it's also read by scientists who are not necessarily directly in autism research, you know, geneticists and neuroscientists. And one of the reasons I'm telling you, what's happening here? Something is not working.
Maybe you're.
Here we go. Okay. You see it now? Okay. So the reason I'm telling you all this is because all of this led me to this job at the New York Times. And I really think that every single lesson I learned along the way in my career has led up to this moment, being able to write quickly, being able to process information about a lot of different biological concepts, being able to write with a lot of accuracy, which, scientists demand. So writing for an audience of scientists has been very helpful for that. And also really knowing that in science, especially, things change all the time. And so it's really important not just to talk about any given finding, but to put it into context of how does this fit into the bigger picture. At this point, when the pandemic started in early 2020, I was already a regular freelancer for the New York Times. I was writing a lot about tuberculosis. Keeps happening. I don't know what's going on here. Here we go. Okay. This was a story about leprosy in India, actually. I wrote about how, the WHO had declared that leprosy is over, but really it's still very much present in India. And this was a huge story, actually, about the second person cured of AIDS ever. So this was a front page story, which the New York Times rarely lets freelancers have front page stories. So I'm just telling you this to say that I was already very much part of their system when the pandemic happened. And then, at the beginning of the pandemic, when we started hearing that this was possibly a coronavirus, I became very interested because I had reported on SARS in 2002 and 2003. I went to China, I went to some of the open markets. And so I had some knowledge of coronaviruses and how they behave. And this became very helpful when I actually started to think about what kinds of things we should be writing about this virus. So the very first thing I noticed, for example, is that in SARS and MERS, which are the related coronaviruses, we had seen that kids weren't getting infected at very high numbers, or at least they weren't getting very sick. And so I wrote this story about the SARS-CoV-2, and that maybe that also similarly mostly spares kids. This story I wrote this in February, early February. So I was really sticking my neck out a little bit because we didn't really know a lot at that point. And it was based mostly on the fact that in a journal called the New England Journal of Medicine, there were a bunch of case reports very early on, and they didn't have any cases under 15. And so I was taking a little bit of a gamble here that the new coronavirus behaves like the other two coronaviruses. And that comes from having an experience writing about science, because what I'm really counting on there is that this is a coronavirus, so it's going to behave like other coronaviruses. So things don't completely change in science between one virus and the other. So that context was very important to have. So that became a theme of my reporting over and over, is how does this finding fit into the rest of what we know? So in the early days, I don't know if you remember, but there was a lot of panicky coverage. And so there were some reports coming out from China and Japan, for example, that people were getting infected and getting reinfected again 2 or 3 weeks later, and they were going back to the hospital over and over. And so this is a story I wrote towards the end of February. And in this story, I really kind of went into the biology a little bit to explain why it's unlikely that if you got infected once, you're going to get sick again. You may get infected again, but it probably won't happen right away. It may happen months and months later, but you probably will not get sick again because other parts of your immune system will kick in. And as you know, that's become a big theme in the pandemic. And here I was drawing on my experience having written about things like HIV and other viruses, and knowing, how your body reacts to pathogens. This is, more along those lines of how the immunity to the coronavirus lasts for years. This was published in November 2020, when everybody was very panicked about whether the vaccines would work. And this story is more recent. This is just from a couple of weeks ago, saying, you probably won't need a booster if you've had one. And all of these, what I was trying to convey to the public is, don't panic. if you've had a vaccine or if you've been infected, you may get infected again, but your body will have produced a pretty strong immune response that will protect you from going to the hospital again. And as we know now, that is exactly what happens in these cases. This is not a surprise to any infectious disease researcher that I've talked to. So it was maybe a surprise to people who were pretending to be infectious disease experts, but it was not a surprise to any of the scientists that I used as my sources. This is a story that I wrote about why vaccinated people need to wear a mask, and the date on this is December 8th, 2020. And the reason I'm showing you this one is to say, as you may know, in May, the United States, the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, which sets all of our public health guidance, they told the US that Americans could stop wearing masks because if you're vaccinated, you're not going to get infected. And this, again, infectious disease experts were just shocked by that. Respiratory disease experts were shocked by that because everybody knew, those experts knew that if it's a respiratory virus and you've been infected once, you may not get sick again, but you may actually get infected again, and you may also spread it to others. And so this story was actually talking about how people who are vaccinated may still spread the virus. So it was bizarre that the CDC did not actually follow the science when it was making its recommendations. We later learned that part of that motivation is because they were trying to give Americans a break from the virus, a break from the pandemic, that even though they knew that this might actually happen. And as I'm going to say again and again, they should have just been honest with the public. So over the course of the pandemic, I've written some very, very technical things for the Times that I would not have expected to see in the paper. And I think part of that is, a testament to how the public had an appetite to learn about science. That they were more interested in science than they've ever been. And these stories, were often the most read in the paper because everybody just wanted to learn. This was a matter of life and death for everyone, right? So the public had to understand very complex concepts, sometimes as a matter of life and death. Experts were trying to, explain all of these things, but not always doing a great job. And the government was making decisions for some very weird reasons that weren't always led by the science, but saying they were led by science. So this all made it very important for science journalists to jump into the fray and try to make sense and try to talk to experts and put it all into context. But, this story, for example, your coronavirus test is positive. That was about a very esoteric metric called the cycle threshold value, which biologists who use PCR machines know, but very few other people know about. And if you told me, 3 years ago that there would be a massively read story in the New York Times about cycle threshold values, I would not have believed you. One of the things that was really difficult about writing stories during this pandemic was how quickly the information came out. Science journalists, we're used to having a few days, there are embargoed press releases that come out from the journals about a week ahead of time. And sometimes you have a couple of days, but you have time to digest the information, talk to experts, figure out what's going on. But in this pandemic, sometimes things were coming out, all day long and all week long. And it was very hard to keep up. And the other thing that was really difficult was that a lot of the information was being posted on preprint servers, so they had not yet gone through peer review by other scientists, but that can take a very long time. Sometimes peer review can take over a year, and it's not the kind of time we had during this pandemic. So even though I had a rule before the pandemic that I did not cover preprints, I threw that rule out of the window for this pandemic because we needed to know information much more quickly. And what that meant is that sometimes scientists were unhappy with me because they wanted us to wait till the peer review process was done. But I firmly believe that the public had a right to know a little bit sooner. Even policy experts needed to know a little bit sooner. But I did want to be careful. So what I did was sort of my own version of peer review, where I would get a paper preprint and send it out for review to a bunch of scientists. And then I would talk to them about what the paper said, what the flaws were in the methodology, what were the conclusions, overly interpreted, what we knew from the paper, but also always very importantly, what we did not know from it. And all of this also became really important because we did not always know that we could trust what the public health agencies were telling us. I really feel for journalists across the world who had not reported on science before, and all of a sudden had to report on, not just on this very complex scientific topics, but also in a way that where they couldn't actually trust that the World Health Organization or other public health organizations were telling the truth. So this is a story I wrote at the end of March about asymptomatic transmission. And there were reports coming out of China about asymptomatic transmission by the end of January. And yet in the US, the CDC and in the rest of the world, the World Health Organization were claiming that people didn't need to wear masks, that masks were unnecessary. And if you had symptoms, you just needed to isolate, et cetera. And so this story was about how there are asymptomatic spreaders all over the place, and we probably should be wearing masks. And, as somebody who had reported on infectious diseases before, I knew that people in Asian countries were already wearing masks. They're used to dealing with viruses like this, China, Vietnam, Thailand, they were all wearing masks already. So it was a clue in a way that we were not doing something that was probably going to be very useful. After this story came out, though, this came out right around the time when CDC finally did acknowledge that people should wear masks. And once again, it turned out that the reason they had not recommended them was not because of science, but because of considerations having to do with economics, and availability of masks for healthcare workers, which is a perfectly reasonable thing to worry about. But instead of being honest with the public, they just pretended that masks were not actually useful. And that kind of thing can really erode trust. So a lot of what I did in 2020 was also really looking closely at these public health agencies and trying to figure out, is what they're telling us the truth? Does it even make sense? And so this is one of the stories I wrote. This was in September 2020. The CDC had come out with guidance saying that if you were asymptomatic, you didn't need to get tested. And that was just very, very strange piece of guidance. And, in this pandemic, because the CDC was shut down and not really talking to anybody, I had to develop a lot of anonymous sources within the agency. And so I was able to get my hands on some documents showing that the guidance was supposedly from the CDC, but it had actually been written by political appointees from the Trump administration and been released as CDC guidance, and that CDC scientists were deeply unhappy about it. They had tried to change it. They couldn't change it. They were told, no, you don't have any right to change this. And so this was really important to get out there. And once it came out, it obviously embarrassed them, and they did take down the faulty guidance and put some new information up that was more accurate. This is another instance of that, where the CDC had information about how the virus is airborne and then just decided to take it off the website quietly. This was also something that one of my sources on the inside alerted me to. You may remember that at the White House, they had this massive party to celebrate a new Supreme Court Justice, Amy Coney Barrett. And then it turned out that somebody was actually infected there, and it led to many dozens of cases. But again, we found out, or I found out that the White House had decided not to trace any contacts at all. The CDC had actually offered help. They had called and said, we're willing to come anytime and help you, figure out who else got infected. And the White House just said, no, thanks. We don't really care. So another sort of series of stories that I wrote was about the World Health Organization along the lines of the mask and airborne issues. And this was about how the World Health Organization was actually very slow to review new information and give guidance. And as you probably know, the World Health Organization gives guidance, for most of the world. The really rich countries have their own agencies and they do whatever they want, but the WHO helps pretty much a lot of other countries in Africa and Asia and South America figure out what to do. And so their advice has a lot of weight, but they were very slow to come to a lot of things. And one of the things that I found out about was that they were not changing their advice on the virus being airborne. So, we knew by April, March, actually, that the virus can be airborne indoors. Excuse me. And yet the WHO was not really acknowledging that. And so I started to look into why that was and what was the holdup. This is, leads to one of the stories that I'm proudest of writing, which is the story about 239 experts with one claim. This took weeks and weeks to report, I had to follow the trail for a lot of people who are consultants to the WHO, a lot of infectious disease experts. There's one committee in particular called the Infection Prevention Control, I believe, something like that, IPC. And they set a lot of the guidance for infectious diseases. And it turned out that I got my hands on a lot of internal emails and some recordings of internal meetings, which was actually easier because everybody was on Zoom or phone calls. And so it was easy for people to record the entire meeting without, anybody knowing. And so I was able to get some of those. And ultimately what all of that showed is that there were just a couple of people within the agency that really believe that hand hygiene is more important than taking airborne precautions. And also, another big reason was that the word airborne has some very specific meaning in the medical industry. Apparently, if a virus or a pathogen is airborne, that means that hospitals have to have a certain level of ventilation systems, for example, and everybody has to wear PPE of certain kinds. And the WHO felt that the resource-poor countries wouldn't be able to do all that. And so they just decided not to talk about this virus as being airborne. But to the rest of us, the word airborne just means it's in the air, and it was, especially indoors. So the fact that they were not telling the world this was really quite shocking. And so these 239 experts came out with a call to the WHO to say, please acknowledge this. And I got a hold of this paper before it came out. So this article came out on the 4th of July, and it had all of that information that I was just telling you about, the recordings and the meetings and all of that. And it really embarrassed the WHO because it was picked up everywhere. And so that story came out on the 4th of July. July 7th, 3 days later, the WHO said, okay, we're going to review the evidence on airborne transmission. And then 2 days after that, it said, okay, yes, the virus is airborne. So I'm proud of this one because of the impact, because I thought it was a hugely important public health issue. And, for a journalist, there's nothing more gratifying than actually having impact and seeing change because of your work. This was another instance where the CDC and the WHO were both giving guidance to pregnant women, and they were completely conflicting. The CDC said pregnant women should get the vaccine, and the WHO was sort of waffling. And so again, this story really took a hit of that. It was published January 28th. They got a lot of bad press because of the story. And so the next day they dropped their opposition and they changed their language to be consistent with the CDC. I'd like to tell you that all of that has changed now, especially in the US, because we have new administration and that everything is great and the public health agencies now tell the truth, but in fact, that turns out not to be the case. I don't think that they are lying on purpose, but they are often obfuscating the truth because they think that knowing the truth might be misleading. It might get used by vaccine deniers. It might be misunderstood, but those are not good reasons to hide information. So this, oops, what just happened there? This story just a few weeks ago, February 20th. So it's a story about how the CDC has been sitting on information, lots and lots of data of different kinds, hospitalization data on how vaccines and boosters work, wastewater analyses. One of the pieces, the biggest probably ones was hospitalization. So it turned out the CDC had been collecting information on who was in hospitals at any given time by age, race, sex, vaccination status. And it was just not releasing that information because they were worried that if people heard that there were vaccinated people in the hospital, they would think that vaccinations don't work. So instead of releasing the information, putting it into context for people and explaining what it means, they decided to just withhold it. But as we know, things always come out. So I found out about this through my sources. And this is another instance where it got a lot of pickup, and the CDC did actually put up information about the boosters, and the wastewater analysis are up to date as well. They were up to date before the story published, but they still haven't released the hospitalization data. So that's sort of the end of my talk, I think. Okay.
Thank you, Apoorva. It's very interesting to actually look at the reports that you actually wrote, and those examples highlight some of the challenges of covering a fast-moving pandemic, as you called it. So we are open to questions. Any of you, faculty, students, want to start off with some questions for Apoorva? I have some questions, but I'll wait to see if others have. Usha, yeah.
Yeah, see, Devina's raised her hand, so maybe we should give her first pass.
Yeah, Devina?
Yeah.
Hello, sorry, I'm a little late because I lost power and wonder if battery's on. Thank you so much for your presentation. It was great to hear how some things you need to report on really quickly, whereas you can also take a slightly more investigative approach to other things. And it was interesting to see the balance of the two in your reportage. So far as I have understood science and health communication and journalism, it's, like you mentioned, you did not take a look at preprint before the pandemic, but suddenly you changed that. More often than not, a lot of people have this idea that once a scientist says something, that's sort of written in stone and you can't go back on that. And how do you think that sort of affected the way people put out official reports, or even journalists reporting certain things?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I think actually it was one of the biggest problems during this pandemic is that because not enough scientists said, we think this is what's going on. This is what it looks like it's going on right at this point in time, but we don't know everything about this virus yet. And what we know could change, our advice could change. For example, if the CDC had said, we think it's okay for you to take your masks off, but we may ask you to put them back on if it turns out we're wrong. If they had prepared the public more that none of the science is set in stone, none of this is the word of God, and that things can change, I think it would have been a lot easier for people, because otherwise it felt like whiplash. It felt like one day a scientist was saying something, the next day somebody else was saying something else. I'd like to think that we, journalists did actually a better job than the public health experts in this case. And at least at the Times, one thing we have tried really hard to do is to not just say what we know, but really put it into context. How does this fit into the whole? And what do we not know? That's all, I try to always put that in the stories to say, I have at least one or two people saying we still need to find out XYZ. I think that goes a very long way to letting people know that this is not the last you're going to hear about this, and this is evolving.
I think our colleague Anjali Lal Gupta has her hand raised. Anjali?
Yes, thanks, Professor. Thanks, Ms. Apoorva, for that great presentation. My question is a very basic one. You just mentioned that you found out from your sources about what was happening at CDC and what they were trying to not reveal. In such a situation where there's so much of information coming in, how does a journalist decide which sources are, more credible than the others?
Yeah, I think that's really another great question. With the CDC specifically and the WHO, the sort of the inside sources, these sources are people that I trust, and they obviously have to trust me because I have to keep their identity secret. So that's been hugely important throughout. And you don't know who they are, so I've done an okay job keeping them secret. But that kind of relationship is entirely built on trust. So I had to be able to trust that the information they were giving me is valid. We have a lot of checks and balances at the paper to make sure that we're not just, getting sort of fooled by somebody. So, I obviously know who these people are, but often you find out about them through somebody else, through another expert that you trust. It's not like I can call the CDC and get access to anybody. So the access comes from the outside in a way, either an expert I already know or an expert I know who knows somebody within the CDC who introduces me to them. So that makes it clear that you can actually trust them. We don't write about anything unless there's some supporting documentation or something that we can look at if we're making claims about documentation. And often, it's looking at who they are and whether they legitimately would have information to, that kind of information. If it's someone who, for example, works in the mask division of the CDC and is talking about the vaccines, I might be a little more skeptical. But if it's somebody who works in masks and is making a comment about masks, then it's more likely to be true. So we have we try to confirm it with multiple sources. So if I heard something from one source, I would go back to 2 or 3 other sources within the CDC and see if they could find out if that was true. They all know that I have multiple sources, but they don't know who the others are. And so it's a way for me to verify that what they're saying is accurate. And then I have to tell my editor and at least one department head. So, in our case, it's science, but sometimes if it's a really important story, even the masthead will want to know who the sources are. So it's, even though they're anonymous, they're not anonymous to me, obviously, but also not to the editors. And that's a one, check and balance that we have. But it has been also a problem in general that there have been a lot of experts during this pandemic who are talking about things they have no business talking about. So, nutritionists talking about infectious disease epidemiology, or toxicologists talking about virology, and because we had journalists who didn't know science very well, and I think they made heroic efforts to write about this stuff. But if you are new to science yourself, how do you know to ask the right questions of these experts? And how do you know what is new to you is not necessarily new? It's just new to you because you're just learning about it. And how do you know what all the context is? So I think there was, especially at the beginning, a lot of confusion sown by some of these fake experts.
Yeah. And then Kanchan, yeah.
I had a question. Oh, sorry, Kanchan, very quickly.
Go ahead, Usha.
Thanks, Apoorva, for the talk. So I had a question about the relative credibility of CDC and WHO, right? And in some ways, it also requires that the journalist understand the internal politics of these organizations and who they're answerable to. So I'm wondering how much work, for instance, did you have to do that, or did your previous reporting on SARS and MERS help you with that? And also within the US, is there more skepticism of the WHO versus the CDC?
That's an interesting question. So the general sort of workings of the CDC, how it's organized, the fact that they report to the Department of Health and Human Services, which also manages the Food and Drug Administration, that kind of information I knew just from having been a science reporter for a couple of decades. I knew how they generally work, and also sort of what kind of personality the agency has as a whole, that they're slow, they're really methodical, they are very, very cautious. They want to be 1,000% sure before they come out with anything. All the things that worked against them in the pandemic, they're famous for that, and they're also famous for being secretive, which was never really an issue before the pandemic, not to this extent anyway. Because if you needed to talk to somebody related to a particular topic, the media office would still connect you. But that obviously changed during the pandemic, so it became a lot more about trying to figure out from the outside what the inside organization was to deal with the pandemic. But again, I was very lucky with my sources there, because they did sort of give me an insight into how the CDC's COVID response was structured, and who might know information. As far as the WHO, actually, most people in the US don't really pay a lot of attention to the WHO. I think they were paying more attention in 2020 because the CDC was silent, because the Trump administration had sort of shut the CDC's communications down. And so they had to look at the WHO, and the WHO was doing daily press briefings for a long time, and then at least a couple of times a week after that. So they were definitely looking at that. In terms of relative credibility overall, I would say they both are beset by the same problems. They're both beset by this desperate need for clinical trial evidence at a time when clinical trials are not possible. Evidence, that's really rigorous and thoroughly vetted at a time when things are moving by the hour. So in that case, I think they were both at fault, and one of them was more at fault than the other, depending on which issue it was.
Yeah. Thank you, Apoorva. Very interesting talk, and how exciting science and health reporting can be. It came out from the talk that you've given, and I was interested in the ethical aspects of science and health reporting, and starting with, of course, the credibility of sources, which got covered in the question that Anjali has asked. But just to take that forward, I'm interested really in the ethics of attribution. Since most of your reports are based on other people's work, and you're deriving from what they are trying to find out about anything that you're saying, right? So do you have their permission to say what you're going to report, right? And then do you ask them before publishing or not? Like you said, some of the things that you're telling people, you've taken it from papers which are not peer reviewed, for example, and some of the health reporting that are done, people are saying they are also twisting facts, for example, right? So that also happens. Some of the reporting happens under pressure from the industry and so on, right? So all of these elements are always also very problematic, right? So from all these aspects, I mean, what do you have to say, right? So about attribution essentially and the ethics of it.
Yeah. So I mean, we attribute everything that we learn, honestly. In straight science stories where I'm just reporting on findings, I absolutely make sure to talk to the researchers themselves and at least 3 or 4 outside experts who have no stake, no agenda in the findings. And then, we kind of clarify so-and-so was not involved in the work or whatever their relationship is, so that the reader can judge how much to believe them. But yeah, we do attribute pretty much any new information. If something is really well known already, then we can say it in our own voice, that we don't have to attribute sort of basic information. But anything that's new, absolutely. And if a bunch of experts say it together, then I might not attribute it to one person. I might say, blah blah blah, experts said, so that to also indicate to people that there is some general agreement. I did try to show a lot of disagreement between people, just to, again, to make it clear to the reader that this is still evolving and there are, we're not fully sure yet what's happening. And in those cases, of course, it becomes really important to say who is saying what. And if there are specific criticisms about somebody, then we always give them an opportunity to rebut. So in the case of the CDC, for example, if I that data story that I wrote about how they're hiding data, I sent them an email with a lot of questions. We have, no surprises rule. Like, they should know what the story is going to be so that they have a chance to rebut. There's no gotcha, here. We want them to explain. And they actually, I gave them 2 days to respond. They took 2 weeks eventually. They took them a long time to get all their answers together. And we didn't run the story until we had a chance to talk to them. And then, I quoted a couple of people from the CDC, a press person, and also an expert they put me in touch with in that story. As far as anonymous sources, yeah, we do attribute, but we always say, obviously I can't name them, so we'll try to describe them as closely as possible. Sometimes it's as vague as a federal health official. Some of that is also what the source is comfortable with, because often they're sticking their neck out by giving me information. And if I am too specific in how I describe them, it'll be identifying, like people will know who they are. So I try to be very careful with how, I sort of that little part of how to describe them, I do negotiate with them. Like, can I call you this? Can I, what do you think about this part? And so usually we come to an agreement on how they will be described. And then we have a rule that we always have to tell the reader why we didn't quote them, because we try to use anonymous sources as little as possible. And so we always say, who couldn't speak because they were afraid of retaliation or whatever the case is. And we're, very clear on that. And regarding preprints, I have never written a preprint about a preprint without talking to the research team. I think that's very tricky to do, because you want to talk to the scientists and get more detail information. And when I said that scientists are critical of that process of writing about preprints, I'm talking about people unconnected to the work, actually, who just want to have first dibs on having an opinion. And I don't understand why they think their opinion matters more than the people I sent the paper to, but that's just how science works. Sometimes there's lots of big egos involved. So, we send it out, but often the experts are the ones sending me the paper. I think one of the things, obviously it helps that I'm at the New York Times, but I also can speak to scientists sort of with comfort. And I think they trust me more because of that. And so they are often the ones sending me the preprints and saying, I'm about to submit this. It's going to go up on the preprint server in a couple of days, but here's an advanced copy. And so I honor that embargo that I've agreed to, I'm not going to write about it until it goes up. And then I send it out to, other experts and have the story ready to go for when it does come out live. But if I've found out something on my own that, without being given it, then no, I'm not going to let them dictate when we write about it.
Thank you.
Just a quick aside before I go to another question. Among the stories that you shared during your presentation, I see quite often a different date for when it was updated. So some of the, because of the web uploads that are now possible, you are perhaps able to go back and update with more recent information on some of those stories you did. Is that part of the practice at NYT, or especially in this fast-moving pandemic, you were careful to do this?
So we never really update old articles. And when you see those updated dates, often it's something really minor, like, our team, there are other parts of the paper that put things within the story, like call outs to other information, those might change, things like that. And if we do make a substantial change, like if you make a correction, there's always a correction note at the bottom that explains what it said before and why it was changed. So we try to be very transparent about it.
Right. Polomi has a question in chat. Polomi, do you want to ask that question? You want me to read it out?
Sure, sir. I can do that.
Yeah.
It was great hearing you out, Apoorva. My question was just to understand how important is it as a science journalist to kind of take into account of all the power plays that is happening across the world in terms of CDC or WHO or government for that matter, to report those information that is coming out during a fast-moving pandemic. Just to give you an example, the Pfizer clinical data can't be published, if I'm not wrong, for 75 years, if I'm not wrong. I might just be wrong. So, how do you deal with this kind of things, and how do you report?
I didn't follow what you said about the clinical trial. What was that about clinical trials?
I think that as far as I know, the Pfizer clinical data, the vaccination data, or the phase 3 data, I think it's not supposed to be released till like the next 75 years, if I'm not wrong. Is it? I can be wrong.
No, actually, it's already published. It's been published in the New England Journal of Medicine. The data's out. Yeah.
Okay. Just to understand, this data hasn't been published earlier, right? Before even being putting out to the public. Before. So how do you report, and how do you have access to all of these, and as a science journalist?
I think it's really important, for the reader to know who has what agenda, right? So if it's Pfizer putting out a press release saying our vaccine looks wonderful, but there's no data accompanying it, and the data comes out, months later or weeks later, then, when we write the story, we know the information was released in a statement, and there was no data. We make it very clear that they're basically just saying this, and often we do always make sure to have some expert too talk about it looks great, but this is what I still need to see, or whatever the case may be. So just being open about that. And I think science is always political. People like to talk about science journalism as if it's like some different niche that doesn't interact with politics or public health power plays, but actually it's always been political. Look at HIV, right? It's like everything that we're seeing with coronavirus has played out before with HIV in terms of access to vaccines and drugs or things like that. It's always been political. And in this case, it just became a matter of making that very explicit pointing out who has what power and why you should or should not believe certain pieces of information. Companies especially, I think, it's been like in booster stories, for example, we always tried to make it clear. This is, Pfizer says this is, everybody needs boosters, but this is what the experts say. And so it just to sort of make it clear that that's just one perspective and they want to make profit.
Okay.
In fact, this power plays issue also has an international dimension, because when you look at the last couple of years, countries like South Africa, the scientists and the medical establishment there, they were doing quite a lot of interesting research and, practices of surveillance and so on, and in India. But it doesn't quite get the same kind of coverage in international media. So there is a certain sort of, imperialism of, attributing credibility to research coming from the global South. Was there a way in which you could filter through some of that in your own reporting?
Yeah, I'd like to think that I have some perspective on that, having grown up in India. But you're absolutely right. Other countries don't often get credit. And, people talked a lot about the mRNA vaccines, but there was very little conversation about vaccines that were being developed in other parts of the world, Sinovac or the Sputnik, other vaccines. Some of them were not as good, but the information at least needed to get out to the public more. And, they sort of did make it seem as if it was only those two companies making vaccines at sometimes. And also what Pfizer and Moderna said often, that they didn't think that just about any company can make mRNA. So this is something very special about this technology, et cetera. I think we, at least at the Times, did try to challenge that. One of my colleagues wrote a story about all the companies that could actually make mRNA vaccines and what it takes to make that. I mentioned to you that, I'm going to write some stories about India, and one of them is about a company called Genova, which is in Pune and is making an mRNA vaccine. So, the way to do that is, again, to shine light on what's happening. I think South African scientists in particular were really quite upset that they alerted the world to Omicron, and then there were all these, restrictions and things that actually hurt their economy as a result of that. And so we actually tried to write about that as well and say that those experts are protesting this, and this actually hurts global surveillance, because if people see that they are punished for raising the alarm, then why would they? The next time maybe they won't say anything, and that's actually horrible for the world. So we did try to highlight some of those issues.
Thanks, Apoorva. Any other questions from anyone?
So I just had one more. Yeah. Apoorva, you said that when these preprints were coming out, you would send it out to experts that you knew, or at least you consulted. How did you choose these people? Was there a choice that you had, or did you talk to other experts to figure out who were the best people in that place to who would be able to give you those advice? How did you do it?
Yeah, the expert pool that I rely on has been built up over time. At the very beginning of the pandemic, some of them just were people from the HIV world that I knew who were experts in virology in general. But then as people gained expertise in the coronavirus specifically, it became those people. There are obviously a lot of people working on it now, but the really, really good people, I still think it's, just a few dozen. So I try to know who they are. I try to make sure that they know who I am. I stay in touch by text, by email. So that when something does come up, I can ask them. And at this point, they also know what I'm looking for, that if I send them a paper and say, what do you think, is this worth covering? That I'm not looking for some thorough, long analysis. I just want an answer on, does it seem worthwhile? And then if it does seem worthwhile, then I can go deeper and they can go deeper. In general, what we've done, science journalists have done in the past is to look up PubMed, the giant repository of papers, and see who's published on similar things. Obviously hard to do with a new virus. But over time, there have been more and more papers published. And so I often go to people who have published on things that are related. And yes, I do ask them, who else do you think I should ask? And generally, if an expert is good, and the people that I trust are people who will say, I don't know if I'm the right person to comment on this, but who would be really good is this other person. But if they pretend that they can talk about everything, that's actually, I think, a red flag.
Can I ask a very quick question? I know we're almost out of time, but I'm just thinking, in all of this, there has been some amount of coverage about health systems, but perhaps not enough, especially now that, the wave is kind of on the downswing. And I'm wondering, what has happened like in places like Milan or in Italy after that huge pressure, what's the after story? So do you see any stories coming up around those sorts of issues?
Yeah, there are. We are a huge paper. We're the largest paper in the world. So I don't always know everything that other people are working on, but we do have correspondents in Europe who have done amazing work, even while the surges were going on, but after. Same with Asia, same with, even the Indian Bureau. People do try to cover as much as they can. And most of that is not related to the science desk, even though they might be writing about the healthcare system, they're not necessarily roping in one of us because we're working on something else. But they often, if the story has some substantial amount of science, they do send it to us for vetting. So that way we often know beforehand what's happening, what stories might be coming out. But yeah, they have done, I think, a lot of stories about the aftermath. For example, in Brazil, after the pandemic sort of went through and decimated a lot, big parts of Brazil. My colleagues wrote about that, and parts of Europe. So they're, in China now, what's happening in China as they are having to sort of give up their concept of zero COVID, what's happening in Hong Kong. There are stories about all those kinds of things.
Shivankan, you have a question? Your voice is
good evening.
Can't hear you.
Maybe you can type your question into the chat. We can't really hear you.
Yeah, sure.
Ma'am, actually, I just wanted your brief commentary audible now, sir. I'll try to get into it with them. So, am I audible now?
You're breaking a bit, Shivankan. If you are having trouble, then maybe you could type your question in the chat.
Sure, sir. I'll do that.
Try speaking now.
Sure. Good evening, ma'am. Ma'am, actually, I just wanted to hear your brief commentary upon science journalism in India, and to sort of think about it. Science journalism in Tier 2 and Tier 3 cities of India. When New York Times reported over elections after COVID, it was about how people all over democracies are voting on the basis of the way that leaders handled the coronavirus pandemic. However, in Indian states, Uttar Pradesh election results were just announced, and it was not really decided upon the handling of the coronavirus pandemic. And even in rural cities and Tier 3 cities from where I come from, even the doctors are not really unscientific in the way of functioning. It's really driven by cost, the number of appointments that they see, the number of people that they would see, the connections that people have with each other is driven by cost. And I think it's really unscientific of the doctors, somebody who studies science quite a lot. So what do you think about how science journalism might be able to address that vacuum? And especially in cities like this, where New York Times may not be as approachable to people because of the literacy rates, because of the unfamiliarity with the language. And I know that the wire science is a huge, it's promoting critical thinking in terms of science. However, again, because of language, it's not able to reach the Tier 3 cities where people, for example, in Uttar Pradesh, they happen to be Hindi speaking, or the other vernacular press and local presses all around the country. So just a brief commentary on that, upon how to address that gap.
I think the absence of local coverage is a problem everywhere, including in the United States. There's just not as many small papers and news outlets that have enough people to cover the news. So there is a vacuum. I'm not sure exactly how to address that without having more of those kinds of journalists. But I think one thing that has happened during the pandemic is that people who are not normally science journalists have been writing about these things. And most of the time they've done a decent job. I don't know that the things that you're talking about need to be written by a science journalist. I think they need to be written by a journalist. And that could be, anyone who understands the local politics, understands the local milieu, can go out and speak to people in Hindi or whatever the language might be that's spoken there and gain their trust and try to understand what the issues are. I think overall, I do see that happening in some parts of the country, but honestly, a lot of what doesn't happen in journalism is because there's just not enough of us. It's a dying profession in some ways, and there's just not enough papers or journalists to do the job.
Apoorva, one last question I have is about this environment of science skepticism that's been fostered quite systematically by right-wing, politics in the US or places like Brazil and so on. So when there is already this kind of skepticism promoted by leaders, reportage on a fast-moving pandemic tends to be tentative. It also comes across sometimes as contradictory. Do you really have to wash your hands so many times a day? Down the line, somebody says, actually, it doesn't matter. It's all airborne. Whereas, there were 2-3 months of panic just about hand washing, right? And in that climate of science skepticism, how does one manage to convey the generally tentative scientific findings, even in normal times? Scientific findings are not, forever. And they tend to be tentative, and it increasingly so in a fast-moving public health crisis like this. So how does one convey, some knowledge of how science works, to the lay public, at the same time while not, boring them with too much detail, but some kind of methodological information about science works? I think you did mention a little bit about preprints and peer reviews, but that kind of thing.
Yeah, I think, that depends on what kind of information you're talking about. If it's misinformation or disinformation that's deliberately planted, by the government or by anybody else, I think those need to be addressed head on. We actually have a tech desk at the New York Times where there are a couple of reporters who track these kinds of bad information that's going viral, and then they write articles that are very specifically targeted to that. One of the things they do that I think is brilliant is one of the reasons for people to turn to misinformation or to not really look at science is because science is complicated and science is slow and it does change and it's confusing for people, and it's much easier to believe something that seems very simple and direct, and so that's why they go there. And so what these reporters do is package their information in just as clear and direct a way. So their headlines will say something like, no, the Pfizer vaccine does not cause infertility in women. It's like addressing it head on. But they also try actually hard to make sure that they do that when information is already viral, and that they don't amplify bad information by repeating it in any way. And they have lots of guidelines on this that they've walked me through sometimes. There's a lot of thought that goes behind it. When it's subtler things that, to continue on the misinformation from the government. So I think one of the things that happened during the Trump administration is that a lot of our time was spent putting those kinds of findings out there and saying, this is not true, having to correct bad information that was being released at a very large scale. It's one thing to have viral information on Twitter. It's another to have the president say you should, inject bleach or whatever. So far too much of the time of journalists was spent during that administration correcting wrong information. But if it's subtler things like, like the CDC saying, oh yeah, you can drop your mask, when it's actually reality is much more complicated. I think we tried to address that by saying, yeah, you might be able to do it now, but here are some experts saying this is a bad idea. So for example, I wrote a lot of stories during that time about, this is why the CDC changed its mask guidance. This is what experts think about that guidance. I wrote about how a lot of the experts that I talked to were continuing to wear masks, how they thought this was a bad idea, especially with Delta coming to the US. We had all seen what happened in India, and the CDC knew that it was just a matter of time before the variant came to the US. So just to put that kind of uncertainty out there. But as you said, a lot of it comes down to what people actually understand about the scientific process. And I've written about some of this because I think it's very easy to blame the public and say they just don't understand science, they're dumb, they're uneducated, et cetera, et cetera. But so much of this is on the education system because, they might educate people on specific concepts. Like people might know facts about things like climate change or about autism or whatever, vaccines, so the big things where there is confusion. But what they don't understand is that scientific process that, scientists have a hypothesis and then they do experiments to test against the hypothesis. And then they come up with a tentative finding and then it needs to be repeated. And that process is not really discussed in schools. And I think that would be much more helpful than learning about very specific facts, which they can pick up later. What they need is that broader understanding of how science works.
Yeah, thanks, Apoorva. For the sake of time, I'm just going to read out quickly a couple of questions instead of having them come on. One question from Abhinav says, as a journalist, we are answerable to the people, but as an employee of the media house, we are answerable to the organization to help them bring more traffic and generate more revenue. But science stories have very limited and specific readership. So how can we write such stories to attract large number of people and serve the interests of both? And there is another question by another student, Alif Jahan, that says, being a science journalist, how do you keep track of new scientific developments?
Yeah, so I'll answer the easier one first. How do I keep track of scientific developments? I subscribe to a lot of tables of contents of journals. I get press releases, all the journals release information to the media ahead of when the papers are coming out. So I get a lot of those. I get a lot of press releases from press officers of specific institutions saying we have a paper coming out about XYZ. I subscribe to MedArchive and BioArchive, those preprint servers, they by keyword. So anything that they publish on COVID, I get a daily digest every night. So altogether, I would say I look through hundreds of papers every week. I don't read them all. I look at all the abstracts or quickly scan. But yeah, I think that's sort of the basic of being a beat reporter, is that I do have to keep very much on top of what's being published in the field. In terms of how you balance the public's need to know versus profit, I'm very fortunate to work in a news organization where I don't worry about profit. The reporters really only think about what is useful to the public. When we think about things like what's going to be read widely, it's not because that'll make us profit, but it's because it's an indication that there are a lot of people who want to know this information. And I think during COVID, that's been a lot of science stories. There were times when, the top 5 most read stories on the New York Times were all science stories. That's, I think, unprecedented and probably won't happen again. And certainly now, the public's interest in COVID has died down a lot. The people are sick of reading about it. But even today, I think a story I wrote yesterday is the second most popular New York Times story on Facebook. If you go to our most read stories listing, we can see what's most popular on Facebook, what's most popular, and what's most emailed. And that story is number 2. So I think good science stories that tell people not just, oh, this science finding, but this is a science finding. This is how it affects your life. This is how it helps you protect yourself or your family. That, that gives them information and context that is useful, but also, gives them some education along the way. People actually want that. I think that's been maybe the biggest lesson in this pandemic, is that people want to learn. They actually want to know what's happening. And so if you write that clearly with caveats, telling them what they know and what we don't know, if you gain their trust, I think that will do its job. And then people will buy the paper anyway. So.
Thanks, Apoorva. It does address both of the queries quite well, and I think we should wind up now. We are already overshot the time a little bit. Nice of Apoorva to spare the time early morning. Over to Usha with any final thoughts, and then we'll close the talk.
Yeah, I mean, really, it was a great talk, and I was particularly gratified that a lot of the things that I've been talking about in my science journalism class, you know, it's like all teachers, right? When you tell them, it doesn't make sense, but when someone from the field tells them, maybe they'll listen to it. So thanks for underscoring some of those principles, but also sharing your experience, you know, and showing that it's possible to do good journalism in a time when I think all of us are so cynical about the business and about the possibilities of doing good stories. So I think that was really encouraging to hear. And of course, not everyone's going to be able to work for the New York Times, but I think everyone can try and do a New York Times type story. So yeah, so thank you very much. And thanks to everyone else for attending and asking those questions. And yeah, so have a good evening. Yeah.
Thanks a lot, Apoorva, and hoping that during your next visit to Hyderabad, we'll get to see you in person in the department.
Yes, that would be great.
With our students again. So thanks a lot for accepting our invitation and facilitating a very fascinating and enlightening interaction.
Thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate the invitation, and it's been really interesting to answer all the questions. So thanks very much.
Thank you. Thanks everyone. Good night, and have a nice day, Apoorva. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.